Is it all right? How can you tell that they both have the
Looking at
light?
this one, light, this one wasn't on.
Oh, so I got turned off? Okay.
I think we're all... Okay, I'm going to talk about the beneficial use of gypsum, and this is in essence part 2 of a topic I started talking about in a webinar last March. So if you're more interested in the soil fertility side, tune into that webinar. And if you don't know webinar where, you need to go to our website. If you don't know it, please pick up one of these cards. It's under workshop tools. There's a grid there, and it would be under soil amendment. So today we're going to focus on how we can use gypsum to reduce soil loss and soluble phosphorus loss. And the reason for that is there's a lot of gypsum. I couldn't tell the whole story in March. And since they put us in soil water management, this is certainly what I felt I should emphasize today. So I hope you agree. Okay, so the emphasis today will be on what gypsum is and why we have the interest to do. Also a little bit, a lot on the role of gypsum in reducing soil erosion. And again, it's part 2 of a topic that I covered in a webinar in March. That is on our website, and anybody who wants to listen to it certainly can. Gypsum is calcium sulfate dihydrate, meaning that it has 2 molecules of water in every calcium sulfate molecule. It is a neutral salt, which means it does not impact soil pH directly. It can exist as a naturally occurring mineral. I have a couple slides I'll show you at the end of some beautiful natural wonders where it does exist naturally on the Earth's surface. It can also be synthesized, and there's a company down in Eastern Virginia called Granco that makes it by reacting Bahamian limestone with sulfuric acid. But it's also the byproduct of a couple of industries. So I'm going to talk about the byproduct gypsum a lot today because there was interest on the part of both of those industries to use this stuff in agricultural production, and they funded a lot of the research that we have. First of all, there's byproduct gypsum from flue gas desulfurization, and we call this FGD gypsum. It's formed when they spray a limestone suspension onto this hot stack gases in a coal-generating electricity plant. These are called wet limestone scrubbers. And they're there because of the requirements for the Clean Air Act to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions by the electric generators. In 2012, the statistics showed that we had about 10 million tons of this stuff produced a year in the United States. But as more and more electric generating plants gear up to meet the clean air requirements and their new scrubber systems are built, it's projected that by the year 2020, we'll have twice what we had in 2012. And one of the places the industry is looking at agriculture as a place where this may Another source of byproduct gypsum is from the fertilizer industry. There's a phosphogypsum produced. If you take rock phosphate and add sulfuric acid, that's one of the first things that's usually done with. You get gypsum as a byproduct. Unfortunately, when the industry went to the Environmental Protection Agency to get permission to use it in land application, EPA decided that it was too radioactive. If it has more than 10 picocuries per gram, it may not be land applied, and virtually all of it fails the test. There are literally billions of tons of this material, so gypsum, stacked along our Gulf Coast. And the largest of the stacks covers 340 acres, and it's 200 feet high. So we could build a town on it. Yeah? Or maybe EPA would allow that. So anyway, what's driving the current interest? Well, in December of last year, NRCS adopted a standard for using gypsum in agricultural land. And byproduct gypsum is believed to be one of the things people may choose to use, and obviously using it as a way of helping, in some cases, in our soil system, as well as dealing with what might otherwise be a potential waste. There are certainly, for use in a cost-share NRCS practice, requirements for purity, and if you haven't looked at Standard 333 and want a copy of it, let me know. I've got it on my computer, and I can easily send it to you. Okay, let me emphasize that gypsum is not limestone. It does not neutralize the pH, it can ameliorate the pH, and if you don't know the difference, look at the webinar I did in March. It's 200 times more soluble than limestone, so for a ton of stuff, you get a lot more soluble phosphorus, all right? And that means a lot more can happen, and in fact, it does. It's considered a moderately soluble material on the chemical scale, all right? 2.5 grams per liter at 25 degrees C, which is kind of a standard condition for determining solubility. Okay, so we're going to talk about using gypsum to tie up phosphorus. So think about the phosphorus cycle. We've got some phosphate in one of several forms in the soil solution. And we know, for example, that in the soil, if there's an abundance of soluble calcium, iron, or aluminum, we can actually get the formation of new phosphate minerals. And in fact, that's what we're trying to capitalize on with gypsum. We're trying to get that soluble calcium from this product we put on the soil to react with the soluble phosphorus there and take both out of solution and into a new secondary mineral. So there is great hope that it will be an effective reducer of phosphorus in runoff. Essentially, the calcium ion from the dissolution of gypsum will react with the phosphate ions that are already there and will form a new secondary mineral. And as you know, that's one of the mechanisms for phosphorus fixation. So we're, in essence, enhancing phosphorus fixation by the addition of this calcium product.
So you're reducing plant available phosphorus?
Well, it doesn't reduce it to a point where it's a concern. Yeah. The amount of phosphorus needed in the soil solution for plants to grow based on some old plant physiology work is way, way, way below any of the levels we're going to look at today. But thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Now, you say old research. That's not high-yield agriculture that we have in modern agriculture.
I don't know of anybody that's looked at it recently. Okay. So first question, does gypsum reduce phosphorus export and runoff? All right, so I wish I could tell you that every question that we want an answer to has been done in Maryland, but you all know that isn't the case. So I'm going to call upon research that's done in other locations. If it's close, fine. If it's a little farther, if it's the only people that did it, we'll look at that too. So this was by a group of folks at Penn State in the USDA Watershed Lab that's right next to them, and it was published in the Journal of Environmental Quality in 2000, and they looked at a whole suite of what's called coal combustion byproducts, because gypsum isn't the only thing. There's fly ash, there's bottom ash, there's other things, and they looked at those products too. We're only going to look at the gypsum data. If you want to know about the others, we'll read the article, and if you want it, I'll send you a copy. I have most of them electronically on my hard drive. They looked at 3 soils, one of which is one we Texas from our Limestone Valley. They used runoff boxes, and some of you just went to the runoff demo. They set them at a 5% slope, and they looked at a rainfall of 2 inches per hour, which is pretty typical. People don't look at light rain. If they look at it, they're going to look at a heavy rain. This is kind of on the high end of what we would, what could occur in a normal rainstorm. They looked at bare soil and grassed conditions. So here's a picture of the runoff boxes. I'm not sure if they used a standard box in the demo you looked at. A while back, folks doing phosphorus research decided that if we were going to be able to compare information across studies, we better standardize something. So they standardized the runoff boxes and they standardized the rainfall simulation apparatus. So the box has a specific length, a specific width. It has drainage holes in the bottom. Different people put it at different slopes depending upon what the conditions in their state are and how they're trying to mimic them. And then there's this little overhead thing, this little gutter down here, which keeps the rainfall from going into the runoff collection area. So Maryland has a set of these, and a lot of other places do too. All right. So again, they looked at bare soil where they mixed the gypsum in. They looked at grass soil where, of course, they had a surface to apply it. And they looked at 3 rates: no gypsum, and they're check, 5 tons of gypsum per acre, and 10 tons of gypsum per acre. And in the bare soil, there were no significant differences in the amount of soluble phosphate that came off the runoff boxes.
Flat, and then about 1970.
And that's significantly different. Insignificant difference means that when you look at the numbers that went into making up each of those averages, there was so much variability in those numbers that these differences could easily have been seen by chance alone. In the grassed surface applied, there was a significant difference in the 10-ton application rate. There was no significant difference between the 0 and the 5 tons. And then when I first read this, I asked myself, why did they mix variables here? Because they mixed it in the bare and they didn't mix it in the grass. But the reason is they thought the bare condition replicated conditions in the field before the canopy closed, and the grass conditions simulated hay or buffer strips or places like that where you had perennial vegetation. Okay, now this group, Norton and his buddies, these are USDA ARS folks in the Midwest, Indiana. They actually looked at field-scale runoff simulations.
That's a good.
We're looking at blount loam soil. The research, which was published in the Journal of Soil Water Conservation, indicates that the soil had a very high soil test level, but they never ever said what it was. So I don't know. I tried to track this man down, but he's retired, and I can't get a phone number, can't get an email. I don't know where he is or what. I would love to know the soil test level. This was a no-till corn bean system, and they looked at four treatments. They had a control where they did nothing. They had a poultry litter application. They had gypsum, and then they had litter and gypsum. And they said they co-applied it. So I don't know whether they put the gypsum on before or after the litter. I know that most other people who have studied it put the gypsum on over the litter, but co-application is way too vague for me, so I can't say. I just can't say. Their gypsum rate was a ton per acre, and they simulated rainfall at 2 inches per hour. Again, fairly typical. And this is the runoff apparatus they used. There are hydrologically separate places on the bottom of this experimental area, so you literally get 2 reps for every setup. The nozzle has been standardized. There are side curtains here that keep the rainfall from impacting or blowing your rainfall from the nozzle to where it's going to be. And this is an example of the apparatus that was used in Maryland, and there's some people in this room that were part of that project. Okay, so here's what he found. And we're going to focus on 2 things, the soluble reactive phosphorus and the total phosphorus. Soluble reactive phosphorus is the same thing I call PSOL in the other slides. It's basically what's left after you filter the water through a 0.45 micron filter. That's an operational definition used by the phosphorus people to define soluble. So in the no-till situation, remember this is a high P soil, unstated how high, but it's high P. And you can see that you've got about 2 milligrams per liter times 10 of soluble reactive phosphorus, and you also have total phosphorus coming off your no-till field. No surprise if it's a high P soil. Gypsum decreased the soluble reactive P by about 50%. Not much of an impact on the total P. Add manure, and your soluble P is greatly enhanced, goes up to 12 from 2. Again, manure tends to do that when it's applied on the surface. And there's also an increase in the total phosphorus. Have a mixture of manure and gypsum, and you can see that the drop in soluble phosphorus is about 50%, and not quite that much of a drop in the total phosphorus. So it looks like gypsum reduces the soluble phosphorus. It certainly doesn't take it down to the point of the treatment that didn't get any manure. Okay, we can't say it eliminates it. It does not, but it does reduce it. Then you would have liked to have known what happened if they kept looking at things again. And here's one study down in Auburn, Alabama, by folks at the university and a USDA facility down there. Experiment Station Bulletin. And they looked at the impact of gypsum on fields that got poultry litter on Bermuda grass pasture. And they looked at a 6 ton per acre rate of poultry litter. Now, before you go into hyperventilation here, realize that Bermuda grass, coastal Bermuda, if it's well managed, has the capability of producing 10 tons of good quality forage a year. It's a much more improved Bermuda than we grow here, all right? And 400 pounds of nitrogen is split applied, is the recommended rate of nitrogen in the southeast for those improved Bermudas because they're highly productive. So this may look like a super high rate, and it is a super high rate to put on at one time, all right? But it's not super high over the season. They looked at 0, 1, 2, 3 tons of flue gas desulfurization gypsum, and they did rainfall simulation at 3.5 inches per hour, all right? They looked at how much phosphorus that came off immediately after application, 5 weeks later, and then 7 months later. Okay, and here's what they reported. Immediately after, There's about 25 parts per million of soluble reactive phosphorus coming off the zero treatment. Remember, 6 tons of poultry litter. Dropped down to 15 parts per million with 1 ton, about 10 with 2 tons, and a little bit more, maybe 11 or 12 with the 2 and 3 tons, okay? When they looked 5 weeks later and 7 months later, there was, as you can see, no difference between the gypsum and the untreated. And the thought here is that, first of all, this is one heck of a rainstorm, right? 5 inches. Is that, in fact, whatever was soluble in that manure got washed out in the first rainfall event. And that's pretty consistent with what people have seen with rainfall, natural rainfall or rainfall simulation with both fertilizer and manure. You get the biggest shot in your first rainfall event. You might get some more above second and third, but if you look at months later, there's not a heck of a lot of difference, and we certainly don't see that here. We also see some economy of rate here. If I was paying to have gypsum hauled to my farm, I don't think I'd go more above a ton, and I certainly wouldn't go above 2 tons, all right? So some helps, more may or may not be better. Okay, their conclusions was the phosphorus reduced runoff in the first major rainfall event, again, consistent with what others have found. They found, their thinking was that the lowest rates had the greatest benefit. And they actually did a second rainfall event a month later, but it was not impacted. The effect is temporary. Okay, so another group of scientists decided to look at simulating buffers, narrow buffers, 5 feet buffers, the likes of which you might find on the edge of a field. And this work was done in Alabama on a fine sandy loam in the Sand Mountain region. This is a region in the southern Appalachians where soils are formed on sandstone, and they are very, very deep sandy soils. They set this up as such that there was an upper slope where they put litter on at 120 pounds of total nitrogen per acre, a runoff sampling zone, and then a lower slope mimicking the buffer where they put on variable rates of gypsum. The slide I'm going to show you is in metric units, but the English units are 0.5, 1.25 tons, and 2.5 tons of gypsum per acre. And instead of a rainfall simulator, they had a water dispersion apparatus that a colleague had designed, and it allowed continuous flow of water over these slopes. And again, they mimicked a high-intensity rainfall event. So here's what their system looked like. This is where their rainfall dissipators were. Each of these plots was hydrologically separated. They put the manure on up here. This is the zone where they collected the runoff from the poultry litter plots. And then the water continued, other than the little bit they sampled, continued on through the buffer, okay, where they again sample the water, all right? So you've got a water dispersion device, you've got a manure fertilized area, you've got a sampling zone, you've got a buffer strip, and you've got another sampling zone down there. So you can look at the before and after it went through the grass buffer strip. And this is what they found. They reported the percent reduction. They had a location where they were monitoring the runoff without any buffer, and they looked at the reduction from that area. So even a buffer helped by buffer, okay, grass buffer. But the gypsum helped more than the buffer alone, although Duncan's multiple range indicated that there was no significant difference between the 3 gypsum rates. Again, there's an economy here, and often it's not the highest rate that someone looked at. So again, gypsum in your buffer strips helps. It doesn't eliminate the runoff, but it helps. It got it down to about 40% of what it was without any buffer and any gypsum, and was superior to a buffer alone. Okay, so can gypsum enhance infiltration and can it reduce runoff and erosion? And the overall answer to this is, yeah, under certain circumstances. But in order to understand the why, and I'm always interested in the how and the why, we have to talk a little bit about a soil chemistry concept we don't usually talk about, actually several, and also talk about crusting and sealing, all right? So, first of all, this is something we don't usually talk about till you take soil chemistry, and I'll be lucky here if 2 or 3 people in this room have taken that. How many people have taken it? Okay, a couple. Oh, more than the last group. Okay. So we're going to talk about ionic strength, and that's essentially the ionic richness of the soil solution. And you could actually calculate this exactly by analyzing your soil solution for all the cations, multiply the valence, and there's a little coefficient. And I will say that if the ionic richness gets high enough, we actually call the soil saline, and that means salt affected. It means that your ionic strength is high enough that it's going to have a negative impact on plant growth, all right? And this is a very cumbersome way of determining the ionic richness, analyzing your soil solution for everything. But a surrogate for it that's very quick, is electrical conductivity. And this is how readily electricity is conducted by your soil solution, all right? And this is a very common measurement in the drier parts of the United States. It's a typical inclusion in soil test labs west of the 100th meridian, all right? It's measured in something called millimoles per centimeter. Those are the old units, or the international units are decimeters per Siemens. It's the same numbers, it's just different units, so if you think in one, it's the same for the other. Okay, so I also want to talk about sodic soils. Sodic soils are soils that are considered sodium affected, all right? And a sodium soil has at least 15% exchangeable sodium on the exchange phase, all right? And what we know from lots and lots of research that's decades old, a lot of this basic work was published by 1955, comes out of the USDA ARS facility at Riverside, California, is that saline soils that are also sodic don't have issues with infiltration. They're still permeable. But sodic soils that are not saline, just sodic soils in the non-saline range, can have dispersed clays. They are extremely problematic, and they need to be reclaimed before you can grow anything in them. Because if you irrigate or there's rainfall on them, the water literally sits there until it evaporates. Right? They are not permeable. Right? I don't think it's unwise to talk about these topics, not only to understand what we are talking about today, but because we have areas in Maryland where either due to intrusion of brackish water, groundwater, or salt spray, we're already seeing some problems with salinity and sodicity here. All right? Okay, so this is a continuum, and when I was a grad student at New Mexico State and was taking a course in saline and sodic soils, the cutoff for non-saline saline was millimoles per centimeter. The conventional wisdom then was less than 4, you're okay. Since then, some additional research has shown that sensitive crops experience yield reductions down as low as 2. So these are now considered to be mildly saline, all right? Now, we know that if a soil becomes sodium affected, and this could be sodium affected because there's high sodium groundwater moving up through capillarity, or you're irrigating with water that has a poor sodium-calcium ratio, you can make soil sodic or you can have a sodic soil naturally. At any rate, if a soil is and saline, that's when clays disperse. Now hang on to that thought because I'm going to do more talking about dispersion. What people in Georgia found starting in about the late 80s when they were studying erosion and crusting and all, was that in regions of high rainfall, and they get 50 inches of rain a year, pretty much like us, evenly distributed across the months, is that they were observing dispersion with low electrical conductivity soils, something which is still not widely recognized among many people in the profession unless they were interested in reading this literature. So we can get dispersion here too, all right? There's plenty of evidence to show that. Now, we get about 40 inches of rain a year. Is our soil solution low enough that we might expect dispersion of clays here? I don't know, nobody's looked at it, but 40 is not that far from 50. So I think we have to be open to the fact that there may be some dispersion due to a low ionic strength or a low electrical conductivity, all right? So some of the same problems people experience in this range, sodic but not saline, folks claim they're seeing here, and the data supports it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about dispersion and flocculation. You want your clays to be flocculated. You want them to attract one another. You want them to form aggregates so that there's interaggregate spaces, because if there aren't interaggregate spaces, nothing goes anywhere, all right? So you want them either plate to plate, or you want them end to end, or you want them end to plate. It doesn't make any difference. All three of these are good, but you don't want them dispersed, okay? These are clays that will not get close to one another, and when they dry out, they'll basically flatten out like a continuous surface. It can be a couple millimeters thick. It can be really hard, and you might have trouble with your seedlings getting through. Okay, so this is a diagram we use a lot. I use it when I teach people in fundamentals. It's a little clay platelet, and we've already talked about the fact that it has charge, and we say, well, the surface is covered by cations that neutralize the charge in the clay. And that's a bit of an oversimplification, because the cations that are right on the surface typically do not neutralize all the charge, because there's not space enough for enough of them to neutralize the charge. You not only have ions, but each of those ions is hydrated. Right? So if you've got a lot of ion in your system, like sodium, that has a big hydrated ionic radius, you can't get enough cations close enough to the surface that they're right against it. So in fact, there's a cloud of negativity around a clay, all right? A cloud of it. And the big thing is, how big is it? Because if it's a big cloud, you got a problem. If it's a small cloud, we've got a process that can overcome it. Okay, so van der Waals forces. Anybody remember that term from the dark ages of their life? Okay, well, van der Waals are really important. It's an induced dipole reaction. It means one little ion comes out of balance and causes another one to come out of balance, and they're attracted to one another. All right. Well, it's an ion-to-ion thing, and it's a very weak force. But if you talk about a clay mineral that might be 100,000 ions on the surface, you can talk about they're additive. So if your cloud of negativity around it is really big and you can't get to this critical point here where van der Waals overcomes the negativity cloud, you're going to have dispersion. And that's what happens when your soil is sodium affected or too high magnesium affected. Both of those have relatively big hydrated radiuses. And when they stack up against that clay mineral, it can't get close enough for the van der Waals forces to overcome it. So you want your cloud to be somewhere smaller than this. You typically have that with an intermediate electrolyte concentration, or EC, and you certainly have it with a high concentration of dissolved ions. All right?
How is that effect diluted in sandy soil?
Well, with sandy soils, you're going to have less of an issue with this, but your clays might still disperse. All right? Crusting. What is a crust? It's a thin, compacted layer at the soil surface that has a totally different structure than the soil below it and a much lower permeability than the soil below it. All right? And as the infiltration is lower, there's more of any rainfall event or irrigation that's not going to go in the soil. It's going to run off. And if it runs off, it could take soil particles with it. So anytime you reduce infiltration, you increase runoff and you potentially increase erosion. Now, the folks who've studied this, of course, have shown that it's worse on bare soils and it's worse with heavy rainfall. And in case you're interested, if crusting's a problem for your clients, there's an entire book on soil crusting. Right? If you want it, I'll take it back to the library so you can check it out. All right? Soil crusting also can lead to very high soil strength. All right? Soil strength is measured by something called modulus or rupture. That's like, think of breaking a 2x4, the force it would take to break it. All right? And this can cause decreased seedling emergence. Some of these conditions, I've never heard of it in Maryland, but certainly in other places where I've worked, the soil crust is so hard that the seedlings can't get through it. All right? So you get poor stance. And there are some places where people actually come back and kind of roughen up the surface so that your seedlings can get through. All right? That is high soil strength. Okay? Okay. So what's our culprit here? And our culprit, one of our culprits certainly, is a rainfall drop. This is a blow up of a rainfall drop. It's been around since the 40s. Rainfall is very destructive. Rainfall has the ability of breaking particles off of soil aggregates, maybe destroying those soil aggregates completely, and leaving that stuff in place, so to speak, suspended. All right? So the folks that study soil sealing and crust formation say, hey, it's really two things. There's physical processes, there's chemical processes. You've got to have aggregate destruction. There's also some raindrop compaction. It actually pushes things together. And when the aggregates are destroyed, the clays become suspended. They're in the water. All right? Now, if there's the capability of flocculating, they reflock. But If your conditions are such that they're not going to flocculate, they're going to disperse, that's when clay particles clog pores, form seals, okay? And they have shown now, the folks in Georgia have shown, that this process, this chemical dispersion, is worse as the EC is lower. So in in soils with high rainfall, this is a problem if your aggregates get busted up, so to speak. All right. So the question, this work was being done in Georgia at the same time. The phosphorus fertilizer industry was funding research to see, hey, can we use this stuff in ag? There was a lot of money to look at it. Will something like gypsum, which has the capability of increasing the ionic strength, cause flocculation so that we get decreased runoff and reduced erosion? Okay? Reasonable, right? So let's see if it worked. This was published in 1988 in the Transaction of American Association of Ag Engineers by Zhang. He was an ag engineer. There was also the soil chemist on his team. They did it on the Cecil Sandy Loam. They did this experiment after soybeans. They disked the field. This was conventional tillage. They deliberately wanted an unprotected soil surface, and they looked at natural rainfall. Okay? So they had hydrologically separate plots, and they had runoff collectors at the bottom of each one. So we're looking at natural storms. So they put data on there for every storm where there was measurable rainfall. Blue is the control, and orange is the gypsum. And you can see, in terms of millimeters of runoff, that the gypsum was quite effective at reducing the runoff. Okay? Incredibly effective. Some rainfall events, and even in the higher ones, did a pretty good job. So does gypsum reduce runoff in soils that are prone to sealing and crusting? And I would have to say yes. Does this effort carry through to erosion? Now, these units are kilograms per hectare, which is approximately pounds per acre. And here we're looking again. Orange is control, green is gypsum. And you can see that the gypsum, in many, many cases, not this one, but in many cases, reduces the soil loss considerably. It was not effective in this very, very bad storm. Turns out this was a 3.5 inch per hour storm, and there was actually about a half a ton of soil lost in this one storm. Okay, remember, these kilograms per acre are really close to pounds per acre. It's 0.9. This is darn close to half a ton. All right. So in a super, super bad storm, gypsum doesn't help, but in many of these others, it did reduce the soil loss. Not only reduced the runoff, but that runoff carried less soil particulate with it. Okay, so another experiment, how effective is gypsum at increasing infiltration and reducing erosion in fields that have been in no-till? So here's a group of people out of Indiana again, Wallace and Norton. They had some tilled and no-till fields. The soil was a ivosilt loam. It's a lussel soil, so it probably has some commonality. And it was an alpha sol. It's probably similar to some of the lussel soils we have in our lussel caps. 5% slope. Corn-soybean rotation. They did rainfall simulation at 2 inches per hour. They did this after the soybeans in the corn-soybean rotation, and they deliberately removed the soybean residue. They wanted to know what the residual impact of having been in no-till was, not what the effect of having residue. And they looked at gypsum at a ton per acre. All right. So here are their plots. Okay. You can see that this is over time. You can see that in the no-till plots, there isn't any difference between gypsum and no gypsum. Those overlapping confidence intervals, not significant. But in the tilled plots, the gypsum did help somewhat in terms of increasing the infiltration rate in those fields. Remember, no protection. Okay. When you look at the soil loss, and this is just kilograms per plot area, the gypsum is the shaded ones. The tilled plots, definitely gypsum reduced the soil loss. In the no-till plots, no different. Okay? Okay, so what did they conclude? You may not always conclude the same things people do, but in this case, I agree with them. In the tilled area, the gypsum increased the EC. Sure, it dissolved. It kept the clays flocculated, and it prevented seal formation. All right? In the no-till, the greater aggregate stability led to less aggregate destruction, so the increase in EC didn't help, because you already have good water stable aggregates. Okay. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the emerging technologies. I mentioned these in the March, but I've got some new things to tell you. Research has shown that both ditch filters and curtains are effective, but there are not yet technical standards by USDA and NRCS for either, although I understand gypsum curtains may come in the next couple months. So here's the ditch filter one, Bryant et al. Published fairly recently. This research was done down at UMES. Those of you that go on the tour tomorrow are probably going to see these. They were designed so that as much as possible of the ditch drain water passed through a filter, and they measured both the soluble and the P, not only in the water that came through the filter, but in the bypass flow. They were set up to look at what did not go through the filter, and that was very wise of them because it doesn't always go through the filter. They sampled upstream and downstream of the filter, and they also sampled the bypass. And they assessed not only the chemical efficiency of the system, but the system efficiency. You know, like, does it work when the water goes through the gypsum, and does it work overall? Okay, and here's what they found. Well, first of all, a little diagram. Basically, these are just ditches that are filled with gypsum. They do have drain pipes at the bottom. Okay, efficiency, chemical efficiency, varied from 57 to 90%. Per storm, it was as low as a negative 11% or as high as 99. Again, the calcium in the gypsum is going to react with the phosphorus in the ditch drain water and form calcium phosphates. So the water that went through the system had a fairly good chance, not always, but a lot of times, highly cleaned up. But the system efficiency was low, okay, 17 to 30%. And that's because 93% of the water was in bypass flow during exceptionally large storms. So if we're going to use these have to be designed appropriately, and we have to understand that they may not do everything all the time, all right, which shouldn't surprise us anyway. So these can work. Not cost shared yet, but that's probably coming. The gypsum curtains were kind of the next evolution of thought by this group. This was funded by a CIG project. And they basically trenched next to a ditch to intercept the shallow groundwater before it got to the ditch, all right? And they filled it with p-sorbing materials. They looked at more than just gypsum, but that's what I'm going to show today. So you don't have the problem with the bypass flow in the ditch because you're intercepting the water on its way to the ditch, all right? And the data suggests huge reductions in soluble P, okay? So you've got a ditch, you have a gypsum curtain that's trenched along the ditch, okay, filled with a p-sorbing material, and they had monitoring wells in various places. They found a reduction from 5 parts per million soluble P before the curtain, 2.2 parts per million soluble P after, okay? It works, okay? And again, checked with a colleague at NRCS, and they believe that in Maryland, there'll be a technical standard for this in the next couple of months. It's on somebody's desk. They're working on it. All right. So I tried to update my information on local sources of gypsum. Was anybody putting flue gas desulfurization gypsum out yet? Was it registered in the state chemist? There are no flue gas desulfurization gypsum products registered in Maryland according to the state chemist, and that information was as recent as either Friday or Monday. But I did find out, thanks to Melissa getting an email out of the email train of the universe, that a company in Buffalo has a relationship with the electric generating plants on, many of the electric generating plants on the East Coast was how he put it to me. They're going to market and ship FGD gypsum, okay? He had no idea it had to be registered, okay? On Friday when I talked to him, although Monday he sent me an email and said, we've got an analysis, we're going to get it registered, and we're going to call it SynGyp, okay? So there's a flue gas desulfurization gypsum we should expect soon. The closest plant in our region is that one in Anne Arundel County, right outside of Baltimore City. So I think we're going to see a lot in the Piedmont. I'm glad you're having it on the program because I think Baltimore County and Anne Arundel County and our Piedmont will be, minimum shipping distance. I think they're going to be pushing it heavily there. Run by a company out of Buffalo with a lot of experience in shipping all kinds of materials all over the world. All right, so I wish them well. So if you want to know how much it'll cost, call those guys. There was an estimate of cost given by Ray Bryant in a webinar that's on the a seminar PowerPoint presentation that's on the web, but it's 3 years old, and I don't know where he got his data. So I hesitate to talk about that. But if these guys are going to ship it, they know what it cost them. And get in touch with that company. They have a website. White Sands National Monument and Guadalupe National Park are two places where gypsum occurs on the surface. They're beautiful places to visit. These are kids going to, well, maybe not kids, I don't know. These are people going down gypsum dunes on saucers, the kind we used to use in the snow when I grew up in upstate New York. There's, you don't get enough snow down there, nor do you have hills in the valleys. But anyway, people take their saucers out there and slide down the gypsum hills. Incredible. We have a number of these beautiful natural places throughout the West. There's some in Oklahoma, there's some in Colorado, and these are the two that I visited. Okay, some questions before, questions after the last version. Are there standards for this? Can it have too much mercury? The NRCS has specific standards if people are using something as part of a cost share program. I think that's a good guide for the rest of us who are using gypsum, where people may not be getting cost share to defray its cost. I'm sure there was a tremendously complicated risk assessment that went into determining those quantities, and I would trust it, all right? But there's a whole list of elements that are regulated if, in fact, someone's getting cost share money to apply gypsum. And I assume, having adopted a standard, that that is certainly possible within NRCS at this point in time. All right? So if you're not familiar with our website, come and get a card. The slides are already up on our website if you want to print out a copy of the slides. Thanks. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Chris, just a quick comment. The material up there in Anne Arundel County, I saw some data on that a couple of years ago. It's very, very pure stuff.
And that was another question. How does flue gas desulfurization gypsum compare to mine gypsum? Several studies have compared those, and they actually find that the FGD gypsum is purer in that whole list of things than the mine gypsum is. Remember that deposits in the earth aren't 100% pure either. And the flue gas desulfurization gypsum is very fine, very fine. Now, if you're thinking of going off in business yourself and shipping it, assuming that's possible, look at the website for Gypsoil. They have been distributing flue gas desulfurization gypsum throughout the Midwest and Mid-South, and it apparently is a very tricky material. It's fine, it sticks to the side, you need a lined truck. But they are very generous about sharing the information they have found to be necessary to have a successful gypsum application operation. Yes?
Sulfur content in the flue gypsum, is it?
It's like regular gypsum. Well, I talked about that in the webinar. Gypsum is an excellent source of soluble calcium if you want calcium and don't want the pH change. It's an excellent source of sulfur, although you don't use one anywhere near these. You don't need one requirements. So it already has tremendous benefits from a soil fertility point of view, but that's not what I decided to talk about today. But that's in the March webinar. Yeah, excellent source of sulfur. And as we clean up the stacks, we're getting less sulfur dioxide in the rain. I think there's going to be more and more places where we just need more sulfur occasionally. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay, thanks.
We've done fertility by foliar management this year, and we saw some pretty interesting results. I'm going to share that tomorrow, the bean breaking barrier